All right, so I'd like to welcome you all to our second research and community colloquium. Last week, we heard from a very new member of our community. It was an excellent presentation. This week, we're going to the other end of the spectrum with one of our longest serving faculty members of our community. So lots of you, of course, already know him and his work, but for the newer members, I'll say a couple quick words. I know Randy has a lot to tell us today, so I don't want to take up too much time. Randy joined us here in Utah in 2001 while he was actually finishing up his dissertation at the University of Chicago. Finished that quickly up, joined the faculty, and quickly became deeply embedded in all of our curriculum and programming. He served on many graduate committees since he got here. And he's also well distinguished as having designed our Bad Words and Taboo Terms course. I think we said that was around 2005 that it started and went up around 2006. And quickly became one of the largest, and at one point at least, if not still, I would imagine still, the largest online class at the University of Utah. His textbook on the topic, this book is Taboo. I wrote it down and then I left it on my desk. This book is Taboo, Introductory Linguistics.
Linguistics through swearing.
An Introduction to Linguistics Through Swearing. That came out in 2011 with a second edition just a couple of years ago, 2019, that's now available to the benefit of all students across the country in an ebook form only, so they don't spend their life savings. He is today returning to a topic that he's been thinking about for a very long time, since he was a graduate student, and of course continues through the work that he's been doing here on this particular aspect of his teaching. But now we're going to hear about some specific work that he's working up into a paper on the topic of a lexically realistic semantics of lexical items, taboo in other words. So please join me in welcoming Professor Randy. I'm excited.
So this is a drum that I've been beating for a while, and anybody who's taken classes from me will know the rhythm. So Sadock 1994 proposed 3 simultaneous, independent, orthogonal communicative dimensions. There's the informational aspect. This is propositional, anything that has truth conditions. This is the area of meaning that usually linguists, semanticists think of when they think of meaning. But what Sadock's argument is that there's also a social aspect that communicates interpersonal relations, as well as an emotional aspect that communicates affect, especially kind of indexes the immediate emotions of the speaker, although there can be a bit of empathetic communication there too. You can empathize with others in terms of the emotional aspect. I want to begin though with the informational aspect, the informational meaning. So we take a simple declarative sentence like Grant juggles, and we can translate it into logical form, something like this. It presumably has a truth value, and we can disagree, right? So it's perfectly felicitous to say, no, he doesn't. We also see that we can bring in explicitly some of the social aspects by making it performative. So I assert that Grant juggles. It still contains that proposition that Grant juggles. And you can disagree with that proposition itself. It would be felicitous to say, no, he doesn't. But it wouldn't be felicitous to say, no, you don't. right? Meaning you don't assert that. That's Austin's point, that illocutionary force, the performative aspect of it, doesn't have truth conditions. That's purely social, interpersonal. So Austin, 1962, writes, with the constative utterance, we abstract from the illocutionary aspects of the speech act and we concentrate on the locutionary. With the performative utterance, we attend as much as possible to the illocutionary force of the utterance and abstract from the dimension of correspondence with the facts. In our parlance, what that means is that the illocutionary, that's the social aspect, and the locutionary, that would be the informational aspect. We can see that some utterances are going to be purely social. So saying hello to somebody, it would not be felicitous to say false. We can also look again at the informational meaning, and we have to recognize that you can describe emotions, right? So I hate that Grant juggles has a truth conditional meaning, a logical meaning, represents a proposition, something along these lines. That Grant juggles in this case is presumably a presupposition. I won't go into that in too much detail, but I wouldn't say that it necessarily entails that Grant juggles, but presupposes it. What's important is that I hate this proposition that Grant juggles. And you can disagree with that. So that has a truth value. And I'm not so sure that you can question that Grant juggles so easily as a presupposition. Usually you would have to do that some other way. But what I'm more interested in is a sentence like this, Grant fucking juggles, which has the informational meaning of Grant juggles. And again, you can disagree with that and say, no, he doesn't. But at the same time, it seems to have an implicature implicitly in this, is that you dislike the fact that he juggles, or the speaker dislikes the fact that he juggles. But again, that's implicit, and it's not something that you can felicitously deny. So again, as we saw with social meaning, the emotional meaning has no truth conditions attached to it. With a sentence like I'm cold, again, you're describing your emotions, but you're not expressing them. It's not indexing those directly. And again, in that case, then if it's informational, you can disagree with them. I do this all the time when my kids tell me that they're cold and want me to turn up the heat. On the other hand, if you just say burr, you may be able to infer from that that the person is cold, but that's because they're directly indexing that feeling. And again, if somebody says burr, you're not going to disagree with them and say, no, you aren't. So Sadock gives this chart. This is adapted from a chart that Sadock gives of what he calls defective speech acts. So his thesis is that most speech acts communicate on all three dimensions. And so it's sort of unusual, defective, when you find a speech act that only communicates on one or two of these levels. So ouch, for example, is just purely emotion, communicating emotion, not information or social meaning. Hi, on the other hand, communicates social meaning, but not emotional or informational. Huh? I got to get that intonation right. Huh? That one communicates a social meaning in that there's an obligation on the part of the hearer to explain what they've just said, to clarify what they've just said. But it also indexes an emotion that you are baffled by what the person just said. I bet $5 that in that case, there's clearly an informational aspect to that, in that you have to know what you're betting about. So you could say, I bet $5 that the Utes will win. But there's also clearly a social side to that, because a bet in and of itself requires uptake. It's not a bet until the other person acknowledges that it's a bet and that they've agreed to the bet. The last one is, boy, it's hot. which Sadock argues is informational in that it's got that proposition, it is hot, but it's also emotional. You're expressing your feelings about it being hot. But he says it's not social, and I actually disagree with him on that one. I would say that it quite clearly is social, that there's an element of phatic communion in this case, where the person presumably wants to commiserate with other people around them, or perhaps spark a conversation. But it would be weird, I would say, in a situation like that, just to ignore the person who said that. It would be somewhat rude. There seems to be a social obligation to some degree that if somebody says that, you're supposed to respond. Unlike ouch, that doesn't need it. And in fact, I think all of us have done this where you hurt yourself and you say ouch, and there's nobody within hearing, which suggests that this really doesn't have a communicative intent in the same way that the others do. This falls under what Goffman described as response cries. And Goffman demonstrates that expressions like this, this would be a pain cry. He's got spill cries like oops. There's a transition where you're moving from a cold environment to a hot, or hot to cold, where you can say, oh. All of those, he suggests, don't have a direct addressee. That again, it would be weird to say, for example, ouch, right? So in that case, these are arguably purely emotional, which isn't to say that you can't use these with a communicative intent. It's just not kind of hardwired into them. So where I want to go with this is that if, as Sadock is concentrating on speech acts, on pragmatics, but if these different dimensions of meaning exist at the speech act level, then we should expect that we're going to find them lexically as well. And so that's where I want to go with this, is to look at the lexical semantics of words and see whether we can find those same elements. And I think we can. So for example, ouch, burr, and yum, when they're put into a sentence or any sort of linguistic expression, they don't contribute anything but emotional meaning. Similarly, hello, thanks, and please seem to only contribute social meaning. And then we've got words like table, see, and rectangular that have no social or emotional value, but just purely an informational meaning. And I would think that probably the majority of lexical items fall into that category. So in this way, it's a bit dissimilar to what Sadock was arguing about speech acts, where the norm is to communicate at all of those levels. We do find that there are these purported synonyms like stingy and frugal that at the informational level seem to be synonyms. They seem to have the same informational meaning, but they differ in emotional meaning in that one has a positive valence and the other has a negative valence. And then require and need, again, are informationally synonymous, but socially they're different, where require has a higher register than need. As I said before, it doesn't mean that we can't use these words to communicate other things. So if you say burr, you may very well want to communicate something social, like, please turn off the thermostat. But that's pragmatic inferences, not built into the words themselves. Also, a word like hello that can communicate emotion when you say it, although that's typically with the intonation that you use, not so much the word itself. So in this case, Seinfeld greeting Newman clearly communicated a negative emotion. And what is this guy's name? Timmy Wiesel, thanks. In the movie The Room, where he says, "Oh, hi, Mark," that's said in a very happy way. So, as I was saying, it's sort of the norm for lexical items to be defective in this way, in that Sadockian sense of lacking one of these dimensions of meaning. I would say that there is one category that are an exception, where taboo words are among the minority of words that are lexically effective, that they have all three aspects of meaning. And in fact, I would say that to understand how words work, what makes them unique in the language, is we have to look at all three of those. So I'm going to go through and just kind of look at what I consider to be the different aspects of meaning with taboo words. So one thing we find is that there does seem to be a pattern of informational meaning. When we look cross-linguistically, there are 7 classes that it seems vast majority of taboo words are drawn from across languages. So we've got scatology. These are, the words associated with bodily effluvia. So anything that comes out of our bodies, with the exception of tears for some reason, but everything else, you'll find a language that has a taboo word related to that. And of course, any body parts or anything like that related to it as well. Obscenity relates to sex and mating. Clearly, there's going to be some overlap here because sex also involves effluvia, and sex and scatology share some body parts. Profanity, these are words related to religion. So we've got taboo words like damn, hell. One of my favorites from Quebecois French is tabernacle. Faunality, this is a word that I coined. These are words that are drawn from terms for animals. We don't see that so much in modern English, or for the most part in first world nations today, but we do find it historically. So for example, if we look at English and other Germanic languages, the words for bear are derived from brown, presumably means something like the brown one. And similarly in Slavic languages, the words for bear are all related to honey or honey eater. And so presumably these were euphemisms dating way, way back, because you couldn't actually say the word for bear. And so it was so taboo that we lost that word, whatever it was in Proto-Germanic, we don't know. We just have the ones deriving from brown. Other ones, appellity, these are words relating to proper names. The only two I could come up with in modern English were Satan and Voldemort. It's a common, though, in a lot of languages. One pattern we see across languages is that when somebody dies, their name often becomes tabooed. You can't say that name ever in some cultures, and for a limited time in others, which overlaps with the next class, which is mortology. These are words relating to death. Again, it's not so common in modern English. Some of the examples I can come up with are AIDS in the 1980s. Those of you who remember the 1980s, AIDS was a pretty taboo word for a while. And it was a big deal when these commercials came on that said the word outright. And it was breaking a taboo. And it was sort of a way of getting the culture to actually say the word. We find in obituaries and press releases that suicide is often avoided. They'll find circumlocutions, or they will pragmatically hint at it without actually saying it. If we go back in English, plague was a pretty taboo word at one time. And we'll come back to plague because it's an interesting one. And then there's the class of indignities, which I think is one of the harder ones to describe. These are words for a group of people, and it's a derogatory words, obviously. So slurs fall under indignity. Now, what I want to note, though, is that tabooness and those classes of informational meaning, they may be interacting there, that there are some classes of words that are more likely to be taboo than others. But it doesn't mean that everything that belongs to one of those classes is going to be taboo. And in fact, for every taboo word, you're going to find another word with the same informational meaning that's non-taboo. So feces doesn't have the same taboo-ness as shit, or Hades the same as hell, or fornicating the same as fucking, and condemned doesn't have the same taboo-ness as damned. So my hypothesis is that taboo-ness is an actual feature of words. And so in that case, if we survey speakers, we should be able to get some sort of consensus about what words are taboo and what words are not taboo. So this is a survey I've been doing for the past 7 semesters in the bad words and taboo words class, bad words and taboo terms class. So at the beginning of the semester, first week of the semester, they rank these 20 words from 1 being the most taboo to 20 being the least taboo. Green, which is at the end here, that was put in as a control. We got some weird results from that, which I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A, but I'm going to gloss over that for now. But what we see is pretty much an agreement. Not perfect agreement, you wouldn't expect it to be perfect, but we find some pretty close agreement on where the words fall in this spectrum. And where we find, pretty clear agreement is if we divide it up into these quartiles, where you've got the highly taboo words, the fairly taboo, the somewhat taboo, and the slightly taboo. I think it's interesting to note that the most highly taboo in English today amongst my students are indignity. If we went back to the 20th century, it would have been obscenity. And if we go back to the 19th century, it would have been profanity. So these things change over time. And again, we see that interaction between taboo-ness and informational meaning, but again, it's not this perfect one-to-one or any sort of, I guess I would say it's interaction, it's not, but they're still independent. The one I want to highlight is asshole, and note that it's somewhat taboo on this chart. And because we're going to come back and I'm going to look at a sort of a more refined study that I did specifically on asshole. Looking at the emotional strength of taboo words, I haven't done much primary research in this area, partly because so much has been done. This is an area where there really is a wealth of research. Jay 2000, and really pretty much everything that Jay has written about taboo words, he argues that the primary function of taboo words is to express emotions. Taboo words trigger a fight or flight response. There's a lot of research demonstrating this. One of the most famous is this one by Stevens, Atkinson, Kingston. Using this cold pressor test, they were able to show that swearing suppresses pain, presumably because it taps into the limbic system, the fight or flight response, releasing adrenaline. Similarly, Labar and Phelps demonstrated that there's higher skin conductance with taboo words than with neutral words, and this is outside of any use. This is just purely mentioned. So they hear a list of words, and you can measure the skin conductance on the palm of their hands, and that's again a autonomic response of fight or flight. There's more research. There's some research using a taboo Stroop test, showing that we have a better memory for taboo words in that environment, and there's also a bit of delay in processing, all of which goes back again to this fight or flight response and the mediation through the amygdala. Just more anecdotally, my Linguistics 1069 class students over the years, I've had a lot of athletes and soldiers in the class, and they pretty much universally report that it's very common before a big event like a meet or a game, that the coach will swear a lot. And the reason seems to be that it's a way of getting people amped up. It, again, targets that fight or flight response. One of my favorite examples of this was a student. She was a climber, and she said that when she was struggling to complete a certain move, her friends would yell at her from below, how did they get the sand out of your cunt? And it would piss her off. And she would suddenly get this burst of adrenaline and be able to make the move. Dwaley, 2004, in a very large survey, showed that taboo words are stronger in a speaker's L1 than in their L2. Presumably in the acquisition process, we really need to fix that emotional value to these taboo words at a pretty young age. It doesn't change so much over time. Continuing on with this, we do find, kind of going along with what Jay was saying, that a lot of times when we use taboo words, the reason is specifically for that emotional value. There's also a taboo value, and I think that's not something we should ever neglect with taboo words. They are taboo. And saying son of a bitch car is a lot more taboo than saying crappy car or something like that. This piece of shit isn't worth a goddamn penny. I've got to take the GR tomorrow. None of those taboo parts really influence the informational meaning. We can get rid of it. It doesn't have the same emotional oomph, and it's not taboo, but the informational meaning remains the same. Which gets us to a question that Potts poses of whether we even need to consider an informational value for these taboo words. And so he argues that you've got the word bastard, which he says is polysemous. It's in one case, it means somebody who was born and their parents weren't wed. But then there's the other one that just means, that basically I have negative feelings about this person. And so he uses these examples, that bastard Kresge isn't late for work, and then it would be infelicitous to say he's a good guy. And his point being that negation can't apply to bastard. It applies to other parts of the sentence, but not to bastard. Similarly with it's just false that he's a good guy doesn't work in that case either. So it's not that you're falsifying that he's a bastard, only that he's late for work. And similarly with possibility, maybe that bastard Kresge will be late again. Then again, maybe he's not a bastard. The maybe only applies to the being late, not to whether or not he's a bastard. And so Potts takes this to mean that it's only expressive or only emotional, and it doesn't have any informational value, which I don't really think makes sense. There's, I think, a couple of problems there. First of all, these examples he's using, in all of the cases, the bastard part is being used attributively. And I think that does affect things, that it's not as easy to falsify it when we're attributing it to him rather than using it as a predicate. But I think more than that, we do think about what it means to be a bastard. So this lyric from Herman Jolly's song, Gin Kicks In, just because your mom and dad got wed doesn't mean you can't be a bastard. And the point being, we can debate whether a person is a bastard or not dependent only on how we feel about them, but the attributes of them. So if we change the way that we look at these sentences, instead of saying that bastard Kresge, we just say Kresge is a bastard. In that case, it's not felicitous to say, I don't like him, but he's a nice guy. Whereas if we negate it, Kresge isn't a bastard, it's perfectly felicitous in that case to say he's a nice guy. Or maybe Kresge is a bastard, or maybe he's a nice guy. So in those cases, the negation and the possibility does scope over bastard. So I do think there's something about just the framing of the sentences the Potts gives. Jay and Janschwitz make a similar point in their response paper to Potts's paper, where they say they give these examples of the shitty little boy versus the little shitty boy. And the point being that in one case, the shitty means something like bad, not good. And then the second case, shitty means full of feces or covered in feces. I came up with the next two examples. I don't want to buy such a shitty diaper next time. And in that case, again, it means bad or low quality. And we could dispute that. So somebody could say, well, it's not that shitty. On the other hand, if we just change the verb, I don't want to change such a shitty diaper next time, you're more likely to get the interpretation, a diaper that is full of feces. And again, you can disagree with that. It's not that shitty. So I do think there's a bit of polysemy going on here. It's just not the same kind of polysemy that Kresge, or Potts rather, is getting at. And what I would say is that Potts is falling into a trap that, you know, for him, it's either got to be expressive or descriptive. It can't be both. But to quote Lisa Simpson, it can be two things. And I would say it can be three things. So I would say that, in fact, these words are simultaneously informational, social, and emotional. So to get at this, I looked at asshole. I originally tried this with bastard, but what I found was that my students, I don't know if it's a generation thing or not, but they really didn't seem to have very clear ideas of what makes a person a bastard or not. It didn't seem to be a big part of their vocabulary. And so I found asshole worked a lot better. So for this is, again, a survey I have them do at the very beginning of the semester. And I have them begin by thinking of somebody who they consider to be an asshole. And so the idea is to develop a prototype. So each one kind of develops their own prototype. And then I ask questions about that person that they're imagining. So one question is, imagine the person you consider to be an asshole, list 4 characteristics that make this person an asshole. And so what I was looking for here was some sort of commonality. Do they choose the same characteristics? Some of them, you know, because of the nature of the experiment, chose very idiosyncratic characteristics where they were clearly thinking of a particular individual and basing their characteristics on that individual. One that I can think of off the top of my head was something like, one of the characteristics was, he is my father. Fortunately, this is anonymous, so I don't know who that student is. What I found is that 54% of the participants listed rude or a word similar to rude. And in fact, I think this number is actually a little bit higher. As I think most of you know, in Utah, ignorant is a synonym that's often used for rude. I got 10% of the participants chose ignorant as one of the characteristics. Now, they also, a lot of them chose another word that also means rude. So it wouldn't have changed this outcome. But 4% of those chose ignorant, but no other word relating to rude. And then I also checked and found there were very few words other than ignorant that means something like uneducated. So I think that really is getting at that use of ignorant as rude. So maybe up to 58% of the people list rude. Conceited, 42% said conceited or a word similar. Self-centered, you have a little bit more than a third giving self-centered. And then inconsiderate, we've got a little more than a quarter. There were, as I said, lots of other characteristics that were listed, but none of them rose to the threshold of 20%. So I put an arbitrary threshold at 20%, and none of them reached that threshold other than those 4. Moreover, what I found was that 87% of participants gave at least one of those top 4 characteristics. Also, in informational meaning, I inquired about the gender of the person they were imagining, male, female, or other, and 84% chose male. So what I would conclude is that the prototype of an asshole is a rude, conceited, self-centered, inconsiderate man. Then looking at the social meaning, I started with register. So on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is very informal and 7 is very informal, how formal is asshole? And there we get a mean score of 6. So pretty much on the very informal side of things. Also looking at tabooness, using that same sort of scale where 1 is not taboo and 7 is very taboo. What I find here is our mean score is right about 3, which puts us just about below the middle point, which again puts us in that quartile of somewhat taboo that we saw in that previous study looking at the ranking of taboo words. The other question had to do in social meaning had to do with what sort of speech act it's used in. So is describing this person as an asshole, a compliment, insult, or something else. And insult was by far the most common. Very few people said compliment. There were a few people who said something else. So the conclusion here is that it's a very informal, somewhat taboo, insulting word. Then looking at the emotional meaning on the same sort of scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is very weak and 7 is very strong. How emotionally strong is the word? There we've got it right in the middle, right at 4. So what we find here again is there's correspondence between tabooness and emotional strength, but it's not absolute. We find it's a little bit more emotionally strong than it is taboo. And certainly we can find many words in the language that have emotional strength that are not in any way taboo. I'm not sure that we would find much that would go the other way, though. So another aspect of the emotional meaning that I wanted to get at was the valence. Is it positive, negative, or neutral? And unsurprisingly, 89% said that it's a negative word. So in the emotional meaning, it's a negative, fairly emotionally strong word. And if we put it all together, then this is the lexical semantics for asshole. At the informational level, we're going to give, sort of a prototype semantics, a rude, conceited, self-centered, inconsiderate man. The social level, it's very informal, somewhat taboo, insulting. And at the emotional level, it's negative, fairly strong. So I want to wrap up a few loose ends here. I want to go back to this previous point about it being about these 3 dimensions being simultaneous, independent, and orthogonal. But as I've said throughout, they still can interact. Just because they're independent doesn't mean that they don't interact. Hughes makes this point that there are these twin processes that are essential to understanding swearing. So as a word gains emotional value, tends to lose informational value. It tends to become more and more vague over time. So we can see that, for example, with shit, where it can still mean feces, but often it's used to mean just about anything. One of my favorite examples of that, some years ago, I was in the student union building and I overheard an undergraduate say to his friends, "Hey, you want to go get some food to eat? Hey, do you want to go get some shit to eat?" Which I thought was funny. I would add to this, I would say that they're not twins, but triplets, that the first step is social stigmatizing. That as a word becomes tabooed, it strengthens its emotional value. And as it strengthens its emotional value, it weakens its informational value to the point that sometimes it loses its informational value altogether in many utterances. So For example, get all cars off the pavement is for walking, not for parking your bloody car on. Presumably cars don't bleed. La putain de... Try to do that better. La putain de voiture est tout rouillé. The whore of a car is totally rusty. Presumably, again, cars cannot be sexually promiscuous. My favorite is Hungarian. I really like Hungarian swearing. And Aniko, would you mind, because your accent is much better than mine? Isn't that beautiful? I wanted to go back to plague because we see that same pattern with plague, where it was a very taboo word, but because of that tabooness, it also had a lot of emotion to it, so that it became sort of the time, similar to the way that we use fucking today, where it was just an emphatic. It was used to add that emotional oomph to a sentence. So she's a plaguey shrew, a plaguey while coming. I'd a plaguey deal rather be a butcher than a calf. And in all of those cases, I think you could substitute fucking. She's a fucking shrew, fucking while coming. I can't get the deal in there, so I just say I'd fucking rather be a butcher than a calf. As plaguey kind of lost its cachet, you see hellish taking over. So you've got a hellish, clever trotting mare, quite the thing, hellish fine. It's a hellish, expensive pastime indulged in by posh folk. I find that one interesting. That persisted all the way to 2004. The first two, there's an interesting phenomenon going on there with hellish actually being used positively, which is a phenomenon we see of what I sometimes call valence flipping, where we can take these words and we can use them positively, where they would normally have a negative emotion. We can flip them and they retain the same amount of emotional strength, but now they're positive. We see that quite commonly with fucking, where what it modifies determines whether or not it's positive or negative in the sentence. Going back to Potts, he notes that. He notes, for example, the bastard can be used positively in some situations. And again, he resorts to polysemy and says, well, okay, we have to posit two different meanings for bastard, which doesn't really make sense because it's so prolific. Instead, I think we have to register that there is this generalized pattern with taboo words that as they get more and more used purely for emotional strength, that not only do they lose, they get bleached of their informational meaning, but they also tend to lose their valence, that they often just get used because they're strong. Speaking of bleaching, I want to come back to tabernacle. This is, by most accounts, the most taboo word in Quebecois French. It comes, of course, from the word for tabernacle, which in the Catholic Church, I'm not Catholic, but from what I understand, it refers to the cabinet where the communion wafers and wine are kept. But what I find so interesting about this is that the youth in Quebec know that this is a really bad word. They use it completely fluently, but they don't know its derivation. And to the point that some years ago, about a decade ago, the Catholic Church started putting up these big billboards across Quebec with tabernacle written up there, and then a definition for it, so that the youth would know why the word is being used that way, I guess. Which brings me to yet another point, is that I talked about these triplets, but there is another stage in this, that as it gets informationally weakened, as that strengthens an emotional value, we also expect it to become socially destigmatized. That what we find is at that point, when it becomes bleached of just about all of its informational value, it starts to lose some of its stigma. We find that with bloody, we find that with fucking. Fuck is an interesting one because 20th century was the most taboo word that gradually shifted towards the end of the 20th century. So that today we find that, as I said, the indignity have well surpassed it. But it is a change in progress. And I find among my students that that's one of the ones they disagree the most with. So in most cases where they're giving it ratings, there's this nice bell curve. With that, you still get a peak, but you actually seem to get several peaks, and it's much more flat, which suggests to me that students really don't know what to do with fucking today or fuck today. But we do find that these taboo words, that they're going to get destigmatized, they're going to lose their power over time. As they get used, we need to replace them. So, for example, we need to find stronger ones than fucking. And I've observed, for example, that cunt is being used more and more that way. This dates back at least to the 1970s. The Exorcist uses cunting at one point as an emphatic. I've seen people use cunty as well in that way, using it sort of similarly to shitty. Which brings me to this final thought, which is really just an excuse to quote Mencken, because I really love this line. All expletives tend to be similarly dephlogisticated by overuse. And there's my references. Questions?
There are currently no questions on Zoom.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say something about different use depending on maybe social settings, or because I was thinking with assholes that people call me asshole sometimes.
Positively or negatively?
In the right context and by the right person, I can definitely see it almost endearing. Like I just did something.
Do you find the same thing with stronzo?
I
don't know if you use it in your dialect.
Kind of, yeah. I think it's a bit more on the bad side.
Yeah.
But my question was, there's no way someone can use the jerk.
Yes.
At least in my English, for being endearing. I would be.
Yes. No, absolutely. And that there's a number of things we need. So there's that valence flipping that seems to enter into that. But there's also, I think we just have to recognize that's a certain aspect of, showing intimacy, is that in those situations, you can surpass certain taboos that would be normally there. So friends can insult friends, that's fine. But, I mean, it's kind of a comic trope that, like the older sibling, is constantly ragging on their younger sibling, but when somebody else does it, they're ready to fight, right? Because, I can insult them, you can't, right? So I think there's probably some of that going on. There's certainly, there's a lot of research into the social aspects of swearing, where actual use, where it's designed to show solidarity. That, for example, there was a study done on workplace environments that when employees of the same status swore with each other, that they tended to report that they had better relations with their co-workers. And when they didn't swear, then it went the other way. So there was a correlation there. So definitely swearing can be a marker of intimacy.
Sorry, just to follow up on this. And in that case, it's just the social dimension that it's varies, or there is some modification also.
I mean, I would say that, there I think we're getting into pragmatics to a large degree. And I would say that you are certainly communicating at different levels. Part of it is that, like, you can only get away with breaking taboos in situations where you feel comfortable that the people around you aren't going to take offense at that. So that's partly why that's going to work. But there's still an emotional aspect to that. And there's still informational aspect, I suppose, as well in some situations. Certainly the informational aspect can be bleached or omitted in certain environments. But, there's still some of that there.
Addison asks on Zoom, did discovering the origin of tabernacle and why it was a taboo word increase the usage or the taboo-ness of it?
From what I understand, and this is not based on any sort of research, I think neither. I think that the signage really didn't make a whole lot of difference. There's a lot of speculation about why profanity in Quebec is so much more common than it is in France. In France, profanity is really not a big deal. And when you say tabernacle in France, people would look at you really weird, like, why are you saying that? In the same way that I think if you said it in English, if I just suddenly said tabernacle, people would not know why I said that. So there's some speculation that it has to do more with the power of the Catholic Church in Quebec compared to in France. But I think to that, largely that's going to be speculative. So to get back to Addison's point, as far as I know, it really had no effect. People I talk to from Quebec still tell me that it's still the most taboo word in Quebec.
I personally have a question.
Yeah.
So as we're seeing, like fucking becoming, or the word fuck is kind of losing its cachet, and now you're observing that cunt is becoming more prolific in its place. Is it something that you've noticed that not only has it been used in a negative way, that it is also starting to valence shift as well and becoming a positive term?
Honestly, I haven't, but I'm not sure that I'm in the right circles to notice that.
Yeah.
One thing I have noticed since I've started surveying these things is that cunt has gone down in the hierarchy. It's still highly taboo. Brits tell me, Brits would say it's less taboo by a long shot than some of the other indignity. But what I found is in the last 5 to 6 years, I would say, I've noticed that that faggot has surpassed it. And pretty consistently, whereas I would say a little over 5 years ago, it was pretty consistent that cunt was slightly more taboo than faggot. Nigger is still at the very top, and it seems nobody disagrees with that one. That one's, when you look at the graph of that, it's like, the 7 is like here, and then it goes like that, just this really sharp decline. So that's, by any count, the most taboo word that I know of in English.
So what contributes to the stigmatization of the taboo words? Is it the frequency of use, or the religious abstraction, or the social aspect, or what? Why do they use the meaning and how?
Yeah, certainly there's going to be a social aspect to it. I would say to some degree, we could say that there's an analog to slang, that there does seem to be this element that we're looking for the next thing. But there does seem to be as well some aspects that may be more neurological. The cold presser study that I talked about, where what they did for that was they had participants stick their arms into ice water, and then they took a baseline to see how long they could hold it in there. And then they had the control group put it in there, who was just shouting random words like brown over and over again. And then they would have the experiment group that were shouting their favorite taboo words. But they found that, there was clearly a difference. So the people who were shouting random words, they didn't have a whole lot of effect. They couldn't hold their arms in longer. The people who were shouting taboo words could hold their arms in significantly longer. But they did find with self-report data that those who said that they swear frequently had a much less effect on that. So there does seem to be something that, like when you use these words, that they kind of lose their power to tap into that limbic system, which gets into Mencken's quote here, the dephlogistication. To understand that, you need to look back at phlogiston chemistry, which is really interesting to study, but it has to do with this idea that of how fire worked. It's sort of an earlier scientific theory of it, that there was this phlogiston that kind of would separate off, and that's what you were burning when you burned things. So if you dephlogisticate the expletives, they lose their power, they kind of burn themselves out. And I think that's the best explanation of what's happening is, eventually we just get burnt out on those words and we find other words that bother us. I know Jeffrey Nunberg a while back said that we should be really grateful to censors, because without them, words wouldn't have much power. Yeah, Kelly.
Well, for that, would you say that censorship contributes to the way things become socially stigmatized? And I ask specifically because it seemed for a while that the word suicide was becoming less stigmatized, and in the past couple of years seems to have become increasingly stigmatized because of censorship, or at least perceived censorship on various social media platforms.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting one. I would say that, so I'm going to distinguish between censorship and censoring. This is one that I'm drawing a blank on their names. These two Australian linguists have made that distinction. I think it's a good one. So censorship comes from authority, typically governments, but it could also be the governing board of, say, Twitter. Whereas censoring is more peer-to-peer or personal, like you can censor yourself as well. I would say that censoring has more effect than censorship. With censorship, you usually find people finding ways to get around it. Shakespeare was very good at it. So Shakespeare was very fond of using French words in French that sounded similar to English taboo words and slipping them in and letting the audience figure out that he slipped in a word that the master of the revels, that was the censor, the master of the revels wouldn't let him use. One of the things I find very interesting, the FCC, they have conceptions of what is okay on broadcast radio or broadcast TV during certain hours and what's not. But when you look at their guidelines, it's totally directed at scatology and obscenity, and mostly obscenity, which I would say is, because a bunch of old men are on that board, that they don't really keep up with these things. When the Supreme Court some years ago heard the last case with the FCC, and you've got people like Scalia arguing about about how bad of a word is fucking, and in his mind it's the absolutely worst word that anybody could possibly say. And I was like, no, it's not. But so I think there's a bit of that lag where I think society shifts a lot quicker than the censors do. We have a hard time, the powers that be don't move as fast. So I think what you find is people policing each other has a much bigger effect. And like with the suicide, I think that's largely because people are very touchy, understandably so, when it comes to that.
There's two questions on Zoom. Another question from Addison says, do you currently, like in 1069 or other, if there's any older or non-traditional students, see a generational difference in tabooness of indignity versus others, such as fuck or shit? It's
a great question. I can't answer it really at all. I don't. in the surveys, I don't ask for age. I feel uncomfortable about asking for age in some of those. I did find, I did ask about the age of the prototypical asshole, and almost all of them said it was between 18 and 30. But I also think that's because of the nature of my question, which was imagine somebody who you think is an asshole. And I would imagine that most of them were thinking of a peer. And so because most students are between 18 and 30, they mostly thought of people between 18 and 30, with the exception of maybe that one student who thought of their father. But so, yeah, to get back to Addison's question, I have no idea. I think if you were to do a larger study that wasn't looking at college students, you might be able to test for that. I'm trying to think if anybody has. I don't recall any studies that have looked specifically at age differences. There's a lot of studies that look at gender differences, not so much on age that I'm aware of.
It would also be interesting to look at other like community demographics as well.
So social class, that's another one people have looked at, and there does seem to be some social class differences. Oddly enough, it's the middle class that swears the least. And the argument is that the lower classes don't have a whole lot to lose, and the upper classes are unable to lose anything. So they're not risking anything. It's the ones who are trying to strive to become in the upper classes that have to worry.
The next question from Indu says, I'm curious about the term seriously and how it has become somewhat taboo. I realize that I might be using that term without being aware of its taboo nature. Could you share some insight on this?
I'm not aware of it being taboo. I threw it in there. This was just when I saw that, I thought it was funny. But I think in that case, it's just the bloody, the fucking, the hell, modifying seriously. Does anybody else? I mean, I may be too old, but does seriously have a taboo?
I think it's more about
connotation
and the way that you use it.
I can see that, like saying seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but that again, I don't think that's the word itself. I think that's just, questioning somebody's veracity is always a little bit touchy. It's a face-threatening act. Yes.
Yeah, so out of curiosity, I was just thinking like it would be interesting to know the gender of the students who voted men as being assholes.
I did collect that data. I haven't crunched the numbers on that one. So I can't say.
So what interesting that you have to share about that? Share that's what green.
Good memory.
Right. I have a lot of slides. Yeah, I know. So I chose green because I was like, that's a good neutral word. That doesn't have any taboo meaning to it. And it's really funny because, as I said, like most of them have a bell curve when you look at them individually and you look at the responses. With green, it is far and away the most of any of them. Students chose green as their number 20 of their least taboo. It was about half the students, which is fewer than I would have hoped or expected. But then when you look at all of their other ones, it's really, really flat. I don't have the chart handy, but you've got like this really high 20, and then for all of the other numbers except for number 1, it's flat. And so I've put that query out to students, like, what's going on with green? And the only answer that I've gotten that makes any sense, and this came from quite a few students, is that when they looked at it, they just assumed that there must be a taboo meaning of green that they were unaware of. And so they just did a shot in the dark of where it belonged. No, or Caleb, sorry. Yeah, I think some of them said that like, using green, I think in some gaming communities, green can mean noob. So I think some of them pointed to that. But I still wouldn't think that should be so taboo. So I don't know why it got ranked as high as it did in some of the surveys, much higher than I would have expected. I'm trying a different word for the next go around. What did I choose for the next go around? I think I chose talk, T-A-L-K. And I'm hoping that that one is going to get better control results. Yeah, yeah.
Could it be that, as you were saying, right, exactly because the taboo word, the meaning of it is so familiar that they experiment with them, like, or I must not know it, so it must be so bad.
I think there was some of that. That's my guess.
So maybe I think instead of just one sort of got 4 or 5 in there.
That's a good idea. Yeah, that's a very good idea. I think I'll try that for the next one.
So I've been very fascinated with coming back into vocabulary. And I haven't done my own research on this yet, but I had heard somebody tell me that cunt used to be the anatomical word for a vagina before we had the word vagina, and vagina was the obscenity. Is this something you've heard of? Have you seen this?
No, that's absolutely true.
Other words?
Yeah, no, that in Old English, early modern, or probably Middle English. I'm not so sure early modern English. It was just the common term for it. You found in London, there are some old London maps that have there's a street that was called Gropakuntalan, which meant exactly what it sounds like. It was apparently the red light district. But it wasn't, so it was not all that taboo. You find in some anatomical works that they used cunt, although that wouldn't have been so common because most of those would have been in Latin, but you do see them in some. Vagina was borrowed, obviously. That one's got an interesting origin. It comes from the word for vanilla, which was a euphemism because when you crack open the vanilla pod, it resembles a vagina.
There's another Zoom question from Jin. It says, I was wondering what your plans are with your data. Do you have any plans for further analysis? I'm assuming you will continue collecting more data from students as you teach the class. I think it would be interesting to look into the data carefully in various ways.
So yeah, to answer, Jin, I would love to sit down with you and talk about it. If you have some ideas of further research, I'm happy to do it. I have my own ideas, but I would love for to collaborate with people.
Questions? Please join me in thanking once again. Do not forget that next week we have another exciting installment in our research and community with another new member of our community, where we can all learn about the exciting things that he'll be talking about. Thank you.